All right, let's get started. Welcome to the first webinar in our Spring 2022 series, Connecting Research with Communities. The series is sponsored by the Adirondack Research Consortium and Paul Smith College. Please join us for the future webinars. Next week, we'll be looking at current environmental concerns and research needs, followed by community-based active learning and research, and then community science, tools for community-based science. So looking at some citizen science ways to connect with communities with research by getting people out in the field. So today's speaker leading us off is Dr. Curt Stager. Curt is an ecologist, paleoclimatologist, and science journalist. He currently teaches at Paul Smith College and has published over 36 peer-reviewed articles in major journals. Curt also brings his diverse background to bear in his books, radio programs, and presentations, blending the long-term perspective of a climate historian and multidisciplinary outlook of a biologist-geologist with the communication skills of a lifelong teacher and writer. In whatever spare time remains, he performs and records on his banjo and guitar. As I pass it off to Curt, I'd like to just let everyone know, chat is just going to be used for if you have any comments or would like to thank Curt or anything. If you have any questions for Curt, please make sure to put those directly into the Q&A, and I'll be moderating that and ask his questions for you. So thank you very much for joining us, and I'm going to hand off to Curt now.
All right, thanks. Let me see if maybe you want to take your screen share down. I'll start mine. Yeah, okay. There, okay. Hopefully that's all visible, right? Mel, everybody, Dan? Could someone speak up and reassure me that you can see the screen and you can hear me okay? I'm not hearing any feedback.
You're all good, Curt. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. I was just telling Mel and Dan that when they asked me to do this presentation, I realized I'd never really talked directly about this before. And it was an interesting opportunity. So this is a brand new, fresh thing. Instead of communicating science like I would normally do as a professor or these other venues, like a lot of the folks listening here too, it's to actually think about how we do it and why it matters. So this will be a quick introduction to why it matters, and then focus on some tips that I've picked up over the years from real experts. And then we'll open up for some questions and answers. But I just want to start the whole thing. Maybe one of the bigger points that struck me as I was putting this together was how the culture of science has changed since I've been in it for the last 40 years. And I remember distinctly the beginning of my career. This is the response you would get from the average scientist if they, quote unquote, caught you talking to the general public. It was considered a bad thing, and for a lot of reasons. One would be it takes time away from real serious science. Another one is, oh, you're dumbing it down for the peons or something, or you're doing this to get attention from the media instead of sticking with peer review. So I want to let you know the culture has really changed, and I'm very glad to see it. There are now people who put on their websites, in addition to their science credentials, they also put down that they're a science communicator. So I think that's good for everybody. But I do find it interesting to have come full circle, or come through this older way of being into what's way more reasonable, I think. And all along, top scientists knew that science communication was important. And sometimes, like the more famous ones, like Einstein here, would take a dig at people who would speak up from academia and say, you know, you're wasting time talking to the public and making it too simple and stuff. Basically, Einstein said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, there's his most famous equation, which is very simple. But yeah, if you can boil down what your main points are, I think that really demonstrates that you have a real mastery of your subject. So I think clear communication is a sign of clear understanding too. So I think what drove this in part is money. Before, if the typical response of the science community was to poo-poo communication, now when you get a research grant from the National Science Foundation here, there's an actual criterion that you're judged on with your proposal. And it's not just, is the science good? You have to do that, of course, but it's are there any other broad impacts for society in addition to just doing the science for its own sake? And so here are some examples right out of the handbook for National Science Foundation. One of the guidelines is, does your proposal improve STEM education and educator development at any level? Or does it increase public scientific literacy and public engagement with science? So these are now valued and actually with a monetary value attached to it. So I think that's done a lot to help make this more acceptable in the sciences. But also on a broader level too, I think communication is very, very important, not just for science, but especially for science in a way, because its main focus is on reality and truth. We live in a special time of Earth history and human history, which is being called the age of humans, or the Anthropocene epoch. And it's where we've become so numerous, our technology so powerful, and our interconnectedness so intimate and global, that we've become a force of nature on par with ice ages and volcanoes. We're already leaving traces in the geologic record, which will be as dramatic as the age of dinosaurs and the age of fishes. So in this situation, the contents of our minds and our hearts, which determine our actions, are actually of ecological importance as well as social importance, and they influence the ecology of the entire planet. And so the art and act of communicating has become a force of nature itself. So I think it's a really valuable skill that you can influence people, and we'll come back to that later. So I think these are all good reasons for why we should take science communication seriously. Another thing is, if you don't do a lot of it, you may have watched somebody like, well, you know, we'll give some examples, Carl Sagan, let's say, or Catherine Hayhoe, or people like that. They give these amazing presentations and you think, well, that looks easy. They've made it simple, you know. Well, it's not easy to make it look easy, right? Just because it looks easy doesn't mean it is. And the same is true of good communication. It's a skill and an art, but a skill that needs training and development, unless you happen to be one of the few naturals in this. So that's another thing about the culture change that has happened in science. It's taken seriously enough now to not only include it in your grant proposals, but also National Science Foundation, American Geophysical Union, or AGU, also offer now training sessions in science communication, so that you can do not only better teaching in your classrooms, but give outreach to the public so people know what's happening in science, or know what science is, or know who scientists are, and also to prepare you to talk to the media. I'm trying to think when this was. I was involved in some of the first ones with NSF through my program leader, who was helping me get the funding and stuff for my grants over the years. And when these started up, I was in some of the first ones. And these training sessions were very rigorous and very stressful. And other scientists who joined me on some of these workshops, you could see how surprised they were, how difficult this can be if you don't have any training in it. So I'm just going to pick examples from people I've met or worked with through the years who I consider really good communicators, and just select some tips from them. And here's one here, John Small. He's he works in paleoecology, my field, over at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. He's one of the more prominent people in my field now. And he is a master at communicating science. He even communicates science to other scientists, like explaining what our field of paleoecology, or the study of environments through time, he's actually been like an ambassador of that to the rest of the scientific community, writing outside of his specialty to show why it works and why it's important. One of the things I think he's the best at or one of the many things he's really good at, is finding the story in the science. There's always a story in there. And if you look him up and look at some of his publications, the titles and the topics are just stunningly dramatic. And that actually helps them get into the top journals too and reach wide audiences. So I'll give you one example right here. This is a photo from one of his research articles up in the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic. He studies lakes up there, which for thousands of years were covered with ice even in the summer. But in recent years, because of the warming up there, the ice has been disappearing, melting away from the lakes, and that exposes the water of the lake to the air. So it heats up and evaporates. And some of these lakes are just drying out and disappearing altogether. And so he took this picture here of some of his colleagues on one of their recent field seasons. And they're taking a sample of water from this puddle, which is the last remnant of what used to be a lake right there where they're standing. And he basically had a way of presenting this as the reason why his research up there is important, because the lakes are going away, and studying environmental impacts. And he framed this as crossing the last threshold of environmental damage to a lake. Here's the last drops of water in an utterly decimated lake due to global warming. That's a pretty powerful message, and he's able to dig that out, and it works for scientists as well as for the general public. Somewhere in there is a wonderful story if you can amplify it. I never had the fortune of meeting Carl Sagan, but a lot of us have seen him on television or videos or read his books. And one of the things he was a master of, one of the many things, was using metaphors as well to summarize and illustrate concepts. So here's one I thought was really good from his Cosmos series. Instead of just saying, oh, the universe is large and this many light years across and all this, he said, the surface of the earth is the shore of a cosmic ocean. Recently, we waded out a little out to sea, enough to dampen our toes. The water seems inviting. The ocean calls. And that's pretty gripping stuff and makes you want to learn more and listen to what he says. So if you can frame it accurately, but using metaphors, the messages get through a lot more clearly, especially if the metaphor is a really good one. One of his mentees, Neil deGrasse Tyson, whom I've also not met, but admire the work of, he's a master of this too. One of the things you'll notice with masters of communication like this is avoiding the jargon. So here he is, this astrophysicist, peer-reviewed publications and well-regarded in the scientific community, but describing cutting-edge astrophysics to the general public, and it's incredibly popular because of how he does it. Even taking a tip from people like this over on the right, the Carr Talk guys, Click and Clack, who did radio programs on auto repair, but they did it in a creative, simple way that you could understand and use. That was Carr Talk. So he has Star Talk using similar approaches, and it's very effective. Like, for example, here, instead of saying in technical jargon, what would happen if Pluto moved in its orbit or something, you say, if you slid Pluto to where Earth is right now, heat from the sun would evaporate that ice and it would grow a tail. It still gets the point across, but it doesn't have the jargon that isolates you from your audience. So here's a local master of communication over on the right here. Rob Carr, who used to work at the Wild Center, at that time, he and I co-taught a course in science communication at Paul Smith's College. It was funded by NSF and others. And through him, I learned that there's a difference in teaching styles or communication styles, depending on who your audience is. So I'm in the college professor. I'm used to these, what he called formal education, where basically you have a captive audience. And so if you're like in this situation on the left here, you're this professor and you can even turn your back on the audience and scribble on a blackboard or whatever it is. And people have to sit there and listen because there's going to be a test on it. But you don't have that luxury in informal education. When people show up, to a nature center or listening to the radio or TV or whatever it is. If you're boring, they'll walk away. They don't have to listen to you. So you have to make it engaging and informative. And so I picked up a lot of tips from Rob, beginning with awareness of these two different approaches right here. It's easy as a professor to flatter yourself that you're doing a great job because everybody is listening attentively. Well, they're facing you, but you might actually not be that effective. You're effective in formal education if people are still there when you're done. So you have to adapt it. I'm going to get my clicker going here. What I learned from the folks at North Country Public Radio over the last decades, especially my co-host for Natural Selections, Martha Foley. Boy, she taught me so much over the last 30 something years of doing what used to be called Field Notes, a weekly radio natural science program. Now it's called Natural Selections. And we're going to be reviving that with a new co-host soon. But one of the big things I learned from her was it's important when you do talk about science is to make a connection to people. You bring it down to earth and say, well, what does it mean for us? Like, why do bugs bite? Well, that sure means a lot to people here in the North Country during bug season, right? So that's a really good window on communicating entomology, you could say, to the general public by making it relevant. And Martha was always really good at keeping my feet on the ground with these kinds of things. And here's one last little tip before we do something different here. It's helpful, especially if you talk on something that could be depressing, like I do with climate change. It helps to end on a hopeful note or a practical note, or weave it in there somewhere. So it connects to your audience and helps them see why it matters, but also if it did catch their attention and their feelings, what could they do about this, having learned what you just showed them? So in this case, with climate change talks, I'll usually wrap up by saying, after all the scary stuff, it's to remind people that we can choose our climate future by switching from fossil fuels, let's say, because we're empowered as a new force of nature. So something along those lines to sort of energize you, make you feel empowered, makes you feel like you can do something about this instead of just sitting there wallowing in it. So here's some specific tips. I often hear this phrase, death by PowerPoint. It's like, oh, don't ever give us a PowerPoint presentation. It's so terrible. And it's not the fault of PowerPoint if that's a problem. It's the presenter. PowerPoints can be incredibly fascinating, powerful, effective, but it takes, using some of these techniques, right? So here's just a couple of tips. I got these from Rob Carr, actually. There was a great list of things to not do, basically, and also things to do. So like this, you pack the slide full of text. It's not reading a newspaper. That's way too much information on there. Just keep it really simple. Have one simple thing per slide. Make sure it's readable. Like, don't have these tiny fonts that are on there that nobody can see from a distance, especially if their eyesight's not good, like me. It's basically this. You size the print appropriately. And remember that the presentations are not for you, they're for the audience. So you need to think of, how is the audience going to perceive this, and how can I help them the most? So these were all great tips from Rob. And I quickly revised all of my PowerPoints up to that time and since then, based on his advice like this. Skip the stock template, make your own. Just use a blank slide, mount your own pictures and your own text boxes on there to what you need. And one more here, remember that pictures are stronger than words. So like I constructed this with pictures from Google Images. The point here is that carbon from the carbon dioxide in our fossil fuel emissions not only warms the planet, but it contaminates the entire food web of life on the planet by entering the plants as carbon that they pick up from the air and then moving through the food chains, so that everything we eat, including like this pizza right here with the green basil leaves and the red tomato fruits and the mushrooms and all that stuff. All of that carries carbon from smokestacks and tailpipes, and therefore our body does too. And so that we're not just a source of air pollution, but we physically, literally are becoming our own air pollution as well. So a picture like this that you can put together helps, I think, rather than have a bunch of equations and text. So another thing is you may end up doing interviews for, local newspapers or other newspapers or radio, even television, sometimes like that, or a testimony, expert witness, things like that. Usually, I'll admit, I don't like doing it much because I get incredibly stressed out beforehand. So I have a lot of trouble with fear management. If you've ever performed or, been in an athletic event or things like that, where the pressure's on, people are looking. I don't have good advice for how to conquer your fear, but one of the things that helps the most is to prepare for your interview, which seems like common sense, but I didn't used to do it until I got training with the National Science Foundation workshops and said, oh yeah, I guess that does. No wonder that person sounded so good on the air. They already knew what they were going to say. You find 1, 2, or 3 points that you want to make. You don't let the interviewer dominate the conversation. You make sure those get made, and you kind of direct the interviewer sometimes too, or help guide them to them. Figure out how you're going to make them in advance. And also, if you can, frame them in the form of some good quotes. Imagine them showing up on a headline or in the text of a newspaper article or mentioned in a radio story or something like that. Planning really helps your stress levels and makes it much better. And then also afterwards, once you calm down, you don't look back on it with regret and say, I wish I had said this or that. You have the notes right there with you. That totally makes sense. So let me break stride here and invite anybody to unmute and speak up or put in the chat. I'm going to present some of these techniques here using a great climate scientist and communicator, Catherine Hayhoe. I'm going to show these slides here. Okay, here she is. I pulled this off the web here. Here's a quote: "A thermometer is not liberal or conservative." She's a master communicator of science and a great scientist. Anybody want to unmute and say, like, what's this here? Did that just happen? What is the technique she's using right here that I recently mentioned, if you may remember? Anybody? I'll give you a minute. Let's see what's the chat saying here. Great quote. Yeah, she planned that ahead of time. That didn't just pop out of her mouth, right? And she knew that could be used, and there it is now on Google Images, right? Here's another one. She's talking about climate change and the greenhouse effect to general audiences. Okay, instead of saying carbon dioxide, showing an equation, something like that, she will often call it heat trapping gases, which helps communicate why it matters too, right? What's a technique in here that you recognize using heat trapping gases instead of the CO2? Yeah, it's a metaphor and no jargon, right? Simplifying, totally, yep. And here's one more for you. I steal her stuff all the time. It's great. I also use this image right here. She said, well, technically speaking, adding these heat trapping gases warms the planet with a process that physicists will often call the greenhouse effect. But that image is not totally accurate, and it's maybe hard for people to understand. Maybe a better way to think of it is it's like wrapping yourself in a blanket. And the atmosphere is your blanket, and the carbon dioxide is what makes the blanket trap your heat. And the more you put in, the more blankets you put on, the warmer you're going to get right here. So what would that technique be? Oh, Annie, you want to speak up? What's the reverse psychology she's using? Well, she's trying to catch your attention. That's for sure. Yeah. That's a metaphor, a powerful metaphor. Okay, sorry, Annie, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. yeah, it's a powerful metaphor. You don't even, need an equation or explain what the greenhouse effect is. Everybody knows what a blanket does. And the more you put on, the more warm you're going to feel. It's trapping more heat there like that. And in this case, I'm putting it in as a picture instead of the word. So these 3 slides right here are techniques in action that the best communicators are using all the time, including, of course, outside science. It's used for marketing, right? Same techniques. They knew it all along. Scientists are finally catching up to that, and politicians use it. The media uses it. Why shouldn't we? Okay, here's one more. What I was just doing with the group here is another technique that Rob Carr always emphasizes at the Wild Center too, is engage the audience through participation. So it's not just the screen talking at you, but you're able to participate. And even in the age of COVID, we have that option of at least chatting or unmuting or looking at each other with the screens. So yeah, anything you can do to engage or show a demo or something like that really helps too. Okay, so that was PowerPoints, interviews, and I'll do this last one, and then I'll give you one big wrap-up example. So for writing, I'll use this. Back in 1986, a lake in Cameroon exploded with gas, carbon dioxide gas, volcanic, and killed 1,700 people and thousands of their livestock. And I had been working over there as a scientist, as a postdoc from Duke University. And so when this blew up the next year, we realized that people we knew and had worked with had been killed too. But because of the timing of this, an accidental contact got me an assignment with National Geographic. I called them up, said, I have some photos of the lake before it blew up. It's an international media event now. Would you be interested in buying one of the pictures for an article? And so this fella picked up the phone and said, who are you? And I said, well, Curt Stager, grad student, Duke University. I've been over there. He said, well, can you come down here tomorrow? So he flew me down from Maine and we started talking and I showed pictures and they said, yeah, these are interesting photos. When are you doing this story? I said, oh, I don't know. Yeah, that'd be great. So basically later on, other folks at the magazine said, like, how did you get this assignment? And I told them and they said, are you kidding me? This never happens. So it was because of a terrible thing that happened to people we knew in Africa, turned into an opportunity for me, a professional one. So timing is unfortunately also important here. But anyway, as a result, here I am fresh out of grad school. I don't know most of these techniques, but I do know the science. They sent me over there, came back, and I'm writing this story side by side with this master editor, science editor at National Geographic. And so one of the biggest things he taught me was that less is more. And he said, okay, read this book, Strunk and White, The Elements of Style. It'll teach you how to squeeze your excess wording down to be really powerful and strong and have no excess baggage in it. So I'll give you an example of something like this. One thing I noticed was I would write up a draft of the story and then they'd mark it up like this. And I found myself writing it over and over again. And every time I wrote it, it was tighter and denser and better. So you don't just write it and walk away from it. It's a work in progress, like a sculpture. And you're polishing it and setting it aside and coming back to it. That really improves it because your mind and your perceptions will change from day to day. So you're like different people. You become different editors of your own work by setting it aside and coming back to it hours, even days later. So one thing I noticed was once I thought I had it really good, they would still edit it even more. And they were throwing away this stuff that I thought was pretty good. And they said, yeah, it is pretty good, but what's left behind is better. So that every word in those articles that come out of National Geographic, at least the way it used to be, I don't know how the management is now with Rupert Murdoch owning it, but back then the writing was really solid. Every single word in there was on purpose. So like, here's an example. What I have up here is an original thing that I would have written as a scientist about the thing and what it ends up looking like down below. after squeezing it like a sponge and all the excess wording comes out like water from a sponge, you squeeze that paragraph, get rid of all the red stuff. The fact that the hyperlimnion, blah, 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 you just wipe out all the words that aren't needed and you're left behind with this solid sentence. The dissolved gas made the lake a ticking time bomb. They were just masters at this. So one of the results of that is if you do writing and you do it with that amount of rigor, one of the results is the stuff's really solid and you actually enjoy reading it yourself years later. It's almost as if you didn't write it yourself. And so sometimes I'll go back to that article. It came out in September '87. I'll look at stuff like this and say, wow, that's pretty good. Who wrote that? You know, well, obviously I did it with the help of the editors, but they were, you know, this is the result. Like I was describing the lake from the perspective of a traditional person. They had local traditions that said sometimes the lake would disappear and it would expose the homes of the ancestor spirits who live at the bottom of the lake. And so I was finding common ground with them as a scientist, trying to describe it here. And I said it was as if the crater were a hole in a field of grass carpeted stone, and I could look down through the hole into an eternity of clouds and blue space. At moments like that, even an American blinded with science can see a lake disappear. So it looked simple. That was months of work under the masterful guidance of top editors. But the result is something that even I like to read again later on. So let me wrap up with an example here where you bring all of these techniques into play as a researcher. This is some work that I've been doing with student colleagues and faculty elsewhere on Walden Pond in Massachusetts, made famous by Henry David Thoreau. The kind of research is this paleoecology or environmental history. That's my specialty here. The basic story is the bottom of a lake builds up the remains of animals that lived in it or pollen from the plants of the forest growing around it. And year after year, the remains of those living things fall to the bottom of the lake and they build up layer by layer like pages in a book. And so the environmental memory of the lake and its surroundings is preserved in those layers like an archive. And you can sample that archive by lowering a core sample. It's basically a weighted pipe down into the mud and you pull it back up with the layers intact. And if you analyze those one by one, it's like reading through pages and chapters back through time with the youngest on top and the oldest down below. And if you look at the mud under a microscope, just a little smear of soft brown lake mud on your fingertips, put it under a microscope and you'll see thousands and thousands of things that look like snowflakes. These are the remains of diatom algae or little animals who eat those and things like that. So that's the kind of work. I had been doing it in the Adirondacks. We're looking at the history of climate change in the region using the sediments as the archive. But I needed more information to show if what happens here in the Adirondacks is just unique to us or is it happening over the whole northeastern region. So, well, I should pick another lake. Well, you could do, there's lots of lakes in the Northeast, right? Well, why not pick something with a story already there so that people will want to hear about it because of that existing story. So why not choose Walden Pond? Because of Henry David Thoreau, he's already got beautiful quotes and a book. Here's one comment. He said, "A lake is the landscape's most beautiful and expressive feature. It is Earth's eye, looking into which the beholder measures the depth of his own nature." And that turned into a guiding quote for me in this project, because I sort of felt like I was working with Thoreau and his writings in interpreting what we found out. Because in fact, it's not only measuring the depth of our own nature as a beholder here, but the lake is measuring our own nature as a species and a force of nature because we have impacted the lake so much. And it's there preserved in the sediments. And so here's an example of the kind of thing we did. On the left is a cylinder of mud still in the pipe, freshly pulled up from the bottom of Walden Pond. And later on, we got dates for the sediments. So this far down, about 8 to 10 inches down, where it's still brown mud here, that star is from the time period of Henry David Thoreau, when he was there on the lake. And when he was swimming in that water, some of the algae that, he was swimming in the midst of is still there in the sediment. And these are the kinds of diatom algae you would see under the microscope there. Back when in his book, he described the lake as remarkable for its depth and purity. Well, that fits with what we were finding with the diatoms. But then if you look at the more recent layers above that, there's a wicked color change. The sediment's now darker, 5 or 6 inches down and all the way to the top. That's the 1930s. The kinds of algae in the lake were totally different. And these are signs of human impacts on the lake ever since. It's no longer the way it was when Thoreau knew it. But we could use his book as a frame of reference to interpret our sediment core. So I'm going to check the chat and Q&A here really quick, just to make sure I'm not missing something here. Yeah, that's okay. We'll address these later. Okay, so I'm just going to continue here and then we'll wrap up and do some discussion. So what's the first step? Okay, you need a platform to build your outreach from. So a peer-reviewed journal article is a really good way to do it, especially now. I prefer to use free access journals now, so everybody can read it. There's no paywall stopping you or some journalist or whomever from accessing this online. So PLOS One or others like that. So we published it. Brendan Wiltsey and some other colleagues. There's a student, David Nardelli. And we put all the graphs and charts and nerdy technical stuff in there. Okay, but then as soon as that comes out, then you do the amplifying from the middle outwards. You contact outlets or people who can contact others and start spreading it around. Kind of like going viral on Facebook, only more structured. You look for media outlets or influential people and communicate it to them, and they spread it around, and then it becomes a thing. And that's what happened with this, with the help of Thoreau. People already knew about Walden Pond being interesting and Thoreau. So one thing we did that was unusual at the time, is becoming less so, is made a graphic novel as well as a technical article. And that was the idea of David Press, who was a former colleague at Paul Smith's English professor, and said, why don't you do this? I didn't even know what a graphic novel was. He hooked us up with an artist from Marvel Comics and helped draw it up this way. And it's funded by my grant for the research, because it's part of the broader impacts. Just like publishing in PLOS One was funded by NSF, my grant also paid for the outreach. And so every year I bring a box load of these graphic novels to Walden Pond. I give it to the rangers, like here, Jackie Clough, and they hand them out to school kids. And it tells the story of Thoreau and Walden, but also the environmental impacts on the pond. Then with, the background with the radio and the National Geographic articles and things like that, and then some books, I made a connection earlier that enabled me to also get the story in the New York Times as an op-ed. And that was through connections with Andy Revkin right here. Some of you may know him. He had a blog on climate with the New York Times for years. And I met him at the ARC conference here years ago in Lake Placid. He plays guitar too. So we hit it off as friends, and he connected me to one of the editors at New York Times for the Sunday Times, and managed to get this right up in there about the stuff too. And there's this beautiful artwork showing the layers and cross section of the pond that I now use in talks. So now there's this great sort of a buzz happening in the media, because people then, retweet all that stuff. So then the timing was good too when this was all done, because there's the Thoreau Society in Concord, Massachusetts has a meeting every year. And so I gave a talk there, able to bring the graphic novels and copies of the New York Times articles to get people's attention, and gave a PowerPoint on this too. And then of course that reached interested people that are interested in Thoreau and the pond, and then to have the real science in there too was kind of a new thing for them. So one of the funny things that resulted from this, was as I gave the PowerPoint presentation and I showed pictures like this of Paul Smith's students collecting cores from the lake, and then showing pictures on the right from the graphic novel of the core sampler right there. That turned out to be really fortunate that the artist was very good in this graphic novel to demonstrate the accuracy of this. Showing this core sampler was, let me stop share here and I'll try to show you. Here's the sampler. I was carrying this when I gave the talk because I was doing some extra sampling on Walden Pond that same day as the presentation. And I left the core there in the auditorium. I forgot it and I drove off. And then I get a text from somebody who says, is this yours? And they sent a picture and they said, we saw this in the graphic novel. And we realized that's the equipment you must have used for your sampling. We're guessing that is your core sampler sitting there in the auditorium. So it saved my sampler to have this graphic novel. And it showed that people were paying attention. It reached people enough that they noticed this. So one of the other things then, you never know who's going to be in your audience. So if you make it as dramatic as you can and relevant as you can, and maybe hook it to something like Thoreau. I took this standard dating technique that we use in our field. We use the radioactivity from atmospheric nuclear bomb testing, which polluted the whole world around 1963 when the maximum of this was. It's still there in the sediments of the lakes. If you can find that in your core, you know that the year is 1963. So I've reframed that as saying that if you go to Walden Pond, this symbol of undisturbed nature, and dive to the bottom and thrust your hand in down to the wrist, your fingertips will brush radioactivity from nuclear explosions in the atmosphere all over the world from the 1960s. And then brought it in here in the context of Thoreau's quote, which seems so ironic now, as he said, thank God men cannot fly and lay waste the sky as well as the earth. Well, it's especially symbolic to have this radioactive pollution there in the bottom of Walden Pond, of all places. It's here in the Adirondacks too, right? Well, it turned out one of the people in the audience was Terry Tempest Williams, a well-known environmental author, and she was getting an award from the society then that night. And so it really impacted her because she had a personal family connection to cancers that might have been caused by nuclear fallout. Here's a quote she used in her talk. I cannot prove my mother, my grandmothers, and my aunts developed cancer from nuclear fallout in Utah, but I can't prove they didn't. And then she mentioned the talk and how it stunned her that the radioactivity is even in Walden Pond, of all places. So there's great outreach right there. If that actually helped increase the impact of it for the people who were at the conference, to have her mention it. The last thing that turned out to be an unexpected thing for outreach was this aspect of the study. Now, why did the environmental problems happen in the first place? It's because hundreds of thousands of people go to Walden Pond now, swim in it in the summer, and they pee in the water. They don't bother going out to the outhouse. It turns out humans represent about half of the total phosphorus budget of the pond now in summer because of things like this. That wasn't even our work. It was a USGS study, but we mentioned it to explain our core. That struck a chord. So all over the print media, on the web, were headlines from the Guardian, the Boston Globe, everywhere. It was saying, according to a new study, Walden water is mixed with the sacred water of tourist loins. Or, please stop peeing in Walden Pond. Or, pee and pesticides, Thoreau's Walden in trouble. Or, Golden Pond instead of Walden Pond. But, at least that made a platform then for talking to people about the problems in Walden Pond, which are about swimming. So I'll wrap up with this one interview here. This is with CBC radio. They called and I prepared ahead of time. What am I going to say? And here's the title for their thing. Walden Pond spoiled by climate change and urine. There's the hook. So here's some excerpts from it. The person said, what are people doing to Walden Pond? They said, well, nowadays, the number of people coming is in the hundreds of thousands. We may be on the verge of loving it to death. So I had picked that in advance to make sure saying that kind of gets the point across. Oh, we're loving the pond to death. We're using it too much. Then the person says, it doesn't sound so very transcendental, does it? Referring to Thoreau. And I said, no, but it shows what power we have as a force of nature, which is a point that I made in this talk earlier and I wanted to make there. I made sure that got in there. And then to put the more positive, practical angle on it, with these changes happen unintentionally. With studies like this, we can see what our impacts are and try to head them off before they get worse. So it's not blaming us, it's saying we can do better, and here's how to do it. So to end here, what's the main message in this entire presentation? I think it's what we started with. It's that what we're learning now as a force of nature is that nature's not something separate from ourselves. We are the elements of the earth, kin to all life. This is from Pope Francis. And being part of the earth and not separate from it is an ancient way of looking at things, but this modern way is also supported by the rock foundation of modern science. And I think it's really an important worldview that a lot of us are coming to. So basically what it boils down to is that you and we are a force of nature, and it's true. We can have effects on the world, changing the chemistry of the oceans, the temperature of the atmosphere, the pollution from pole to pole, but we can also make change for good if we're aware of it. And especially by interacting with one another, which is how that power happened in the first place. And so it's also important to remember that we're not only a force of nature, but each of us has a sphere of influence that's fed and amplified in both directions by clear communication. And in this age of, truth relativity and fake news, I think science is our clearest window on reality. And anything we can do to help people understand that and use it is a benefit not only to society, but for the entire planet. So I'll welcome you to the age of humans, and I'll end here. You can open up for comments or questions.
Thank you so much, Curt. That was wonderful. I will read one of the questions from Q&A from Glenn McClure at Paul Smith College. You are both a scientist and a performer. NSF recognizes the role of artists as science communicators. Our academic training often builds barriers between the sciences and the arts, but our lives connect them. Can you speak to our experiences as artists and performers, from the school drama club and professional performances to the winter carnival lawn chair ladies that build science communication skills?
Yeah. Glenn McClure is like exhibit A for communicating science, and especially enlisting the power of the arts for this. The visual arts, the auditory arts, the music and writing communication, this is how you get the information across. And using the visual arts, let's say, for these metaphors or the pictures of a blanket, or in the case of Glenn, taking scientific graphs and turning them into a melody, a musical melody, and then maybe even working them into an opera like his folk opera, that goes directly to your heart, which is what the best science communication does by going through your eyes, let's say reading a chart or something, or a scientific paper, and then if it really makes an impact here, it'll work its way down. This goes straight to it with the arts. And if it's tied closely to real science, like especially Glenn's work is, then it's an incredibly powerful combination. Anything we can do, which I think we do a lot of at Paul Smith College now, or increasing amounts. That's one of Glenn's main things, and other faculty at the college too. The Wild Center and places like that are realizing this and making a precious alliance, I would say, between the arts and actually the faith community too, and the sciences, as a new force of nature with geologic scope. So yeah, it's happening, and the more the better, I say.
Great, thank you. Okay, here's another question that was put in chat. So I'll ask, please put questions that you'd like answered in the Q&A, but we'll go with this one. So Jay Young asks, Curt, there are a lot of ongoing discussions about the general public's decreasing trust of experts in different fields. Over the last 10 or 20 years, the public appears less and less likely to trust the experience and information presented by qualified scientists, medical experts, historians, etc. Any thoughts on addressing anti-intellectualism?
Yeah. It terrifies me, actually. It really terrifies me. Science is our most precious gift for determining physical reality. And to attack that, it's stunning that it's being done now. But frankly, if you look at history, it's actually usually been this way. So I try not to get too depressed about it. One thing to do is watch where this distrust is coming from. And it's coming from master communicators. They're professionals. They know how to, we call it, when we don't like it, we say they're manipulating the audience. If you do like it, you say they're convincing the audience or engaging the, well, all right, so it's their basic techniques, a lot of which I did here, like repeat, 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 even if it's a lie. Well, that works for any message, right? So we can actually use some of those techniques ourselves. And I think one of the most powerful ways to penetrate that is to try to make a human connection to the people you're talking to. Because a lot of times, if it's not your expertise, it's not the facts that convince you, it's a feeling of trust in the way the person presented it. If you can show your humanity and a personal connection to those folks you're talking to, also assuming that you've already selected that they're amenable to communication. If not, you're wasting your time. But if they are, make the human connection. And I'll give you a quick example. Years ago, I was giving a talk on climate change at Echo. I guess it was in Burlington. It was like a beer parlor kind of setting. It was really great. I gave my talk and I prefaced it by saying, those of you that don't know me, I actually had a reputation some years back as a climate skeptic. And to the point that Bill McKibben, world famous climate activist, singled me out as one of the few remaining scientists who is not convinced global warming is caused by humans. Fact was, actually, most of the people in my field were still doubtful until we had more science in, and then we changed our minds accordingly. Anyway, by presenting that and saying, I am now going to show you what it took to change my mind. So then I give the climate talk and the science and got the credentials too. And okay, so I made the human connection. Well, at the end of the talk, I'm leaving and this fellow walks up from the crowd and pulls me aside and said, don't tell my friends I'm telling you this, but we're all conservatives. We didn't believe climate change and any of this stuff, but you changed my mind because of how you did it. So if you can find a way to do the one-on-one personal connection instead of just being another talking head on a screen like I am now, that's your most powerful thing, the human connection. And that's what the folks you disagree with doing this, they're doing that all the time. I'm one of you, even though they're not. You can do it and tell the truth.
Thank you. Here's another one from Zachary Matson. What Adirondack science have you been surprised that has not gained greater attention?
Oh boy. Nothing like that surprises me anymore. Sad to say. I see science communication as something you just do because it's the right thing to do, not because you're going to change everybody's minds. Bill McKibben says that. If you've ever heard him talk, he says it almost every time. He reminds you, he wrote the first popular widespread book on global warming. And he always says that when I wrote that and it was selling all over the world, I thought, well, everything's fixed. People are going to read it and they're going to, it's like, no. And most of us are never going to have the impact that Bill McKibben did. So you do it because it's the right thing, And now I've lost my train of thought there. What was the original question?
What Adirondack science have you been surprised has not gained greater attention?
Oh God, there's so much, most people don't have time for science and it's something that bores them normally. One of the coolest things I think a lot of folks don't realize the Adirondacks was the center of attention for acid rain for years, decades ago, which was the environmental issue of the day. And things that happen here, for example, the coring device, the techniques that I use now were developed here, a lot of it, to study acid rain and study the history of acid rain in the lakes. And that was what really nailed it down, because using the same playbook the fossil fuel industry uses now, the coal-fired power plants that were causing this did the same thing. They did acid rain denial and said it wasn't them, the lakes were always acid, thinking that because no one had been there to measure the lakes 100 years ago, no one could disprove that the lakes had always been acidic. Well, the sediment cores showed otherwise. Surprise, surprise. The difference was people respected science more back then, and that forced legislation from both houses of Congress to make federal level EPA legislation to control acid emissions. And it was a success. It was government oversight, multi-state regulations, amending the Clean Air Act and all that stuff. And it didn't bust the bank for the utilities. We still have them and they're still rich, even though they said otherwise. The folks who are now measuring the acidity of rainfall and lakes and streams are finding a gradual decline. Lakes and species are recovering. It's an incredible success story showing what can be done with federal level legislation and good science, which is then a smaller version of the same issue going on now with climate change, although now in another environment. So I think it's an important story to tell, that we've already demonstrated we can do this. And of course, the source of the problem then was also fossil fuels. So it should serve as a global model for why it's important to do what we're trying to do with climate change too, here in the Adirondacks.
So there's lots of comments in chat and one in Q&A, thanking you for the presentation and for all of the tips that people can take for both writing presentations of all sorts of different formats. Jane Oppelander would like to know where she could get a copy of the graphic novel.
Yeah, I can send you a hard copy. There's an electronic copy on the Paul Smith College website. If you hunt around, is it under, I don't know, the natural sciences or something like that? It's somewhere on our website. Right there, you can actually read it right there. It's a big file, so if you wanted me to send you the file to have printed, you can send me a thumb drive or something like that. But it's, yeah, the NSF and now Caroline Lucy, the Draper Lucy Endowed Chair Fund supports me in sending those. If someone wants to use it for schools or something like that, I can mail it to you.
I'll also track down the link and make sure to put that up on the YouTube channel along with the recording of this presentation that will be available right after. So thank you. Okay, so I think that is all of our questions. Let me double check in chat here. Acid rain success. Yep, so there's some great comments in there that we'll make sure to put up. So I think that that's a great one to end on. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to email Curt C. Stager at paulsmiths.edu or me, Mel Johnson, so mjohnson@paulsmiths.edu, and we will make sure to get that information up on the YouTube channel and the ARC website. So the ARC website is this www.adkresearch.org, and we'll have a link to the YouTube channel with copies of both this and all of with recordings of this and all of our other webinars from the past and for the rest of our series. So thank you all so much for joining us. And Curt, that was absolutely amazing. You do so many different venues for communicating that you were just the perfect person for this. Thank you so much for taking the time to kick off our whole series. Okay, thanks everyone, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.